Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Alicia Seckham. According to the African Development Bank, Zimbabwe's economy is set to grow by 5.5% in 2013, a promising outlook for the SADC country, infamous for a recession spanning from 2000 to 2009. It seems that the country has now rebounded and ready to shake off its past.
Zimbabwe, the landlocked southern African country, home to 12.8 million, has been undergoing economic recovery following what has been called the last decade. During the recession, the economy shrank by roughly 40%. This is attributed mainly to alleged mismanagement and corruption by the ZANU-PF-led government and the controversial land redistribution of 2000, which hurt agriculture, the economy's backbone. One of the hallmarks of the downward spiral was hyperinflation, which peaked at around 79 billion% per month in 2008, the worst case in the 21st century. However, in a textbook turnaround, month-on-month inflation bottomed at negative 3% in March 2009 after the newly formed Government of National Unity stabilized prices through the introduction of multiple currencies. Soon, economic growth in the southern African state rebounded, with the economy regaining much of what was lost. Growth slowed down to 4.7% from 9% in 2011. In 2011, the economy was valued at $9.9 billion from $7.5 billion in 2010. This growth was on the back of a boom in the mining industry, which contributed 44% to GDP in 2011. This was particularly in gold and platinum, and the discovery and exploitation of diamonds. Other major sectors include agriculture and manufacturing. The economy still faces economic difficulties. These include political uncertainty, infrastructure and regulatory deficiencies, a large external debt burden, and insufficient formal employment.
Despite these challenges, there seems to be hope. Zimbabwe has gone from breadbasket to basket case and perhaps is on its path to becoming a breadbasket once again. Panashe Chikmadzi, Johannesburg.
Joining me in studio now to take a closer look at Zimbabwe as a business and investment destination is George Maniere. He's Managing Partner and Chief Investment Officer at Brainworks Capital Management. Martin Davies, CEO of Frontier Advisory, and Suresh Chetu, who's Regional Manager of Banks and DFIs Africa and Latin America at RMB as well. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for joining us. Suresh, let's perhaps start off with you because we've heard comments like those from Economic Planning and Investment Promotion Minister Tapiwa Mashakada saying that Zimbabwe is open for business and that opportunities are spread across a wide spectrum of all sectors of the economy. What's the investment case that Zimbabwe is putting for you on the table right now?
I think, Alicia, it's absolutely true that there are a number of investment opportunities in the country. I think one of the key things for investors, particularly in the banking sector, has been either lack of clarity in terms of policy or certain policy decisions that have been made, and the most recent declaration by the Empowerment Minister now to target foreign-owned banks, I think leaves a lot of uncertainty within the banking sector. Certainly, we see that there are a number of opportunities within the banking sector, particularly if there is a stability, and number two, if they recapitalize the banks and also open up the banks to foreign investment. I think there are a number of significant opportunities. But the key mantra within the investor community, particularly in the banking sector, is clarity. Yeah. And ensuring that whatever policy decisions that are being made within Zimbabwe are actually carried through when investors actually decide to invest in the country.
George, of course, investors will only take advantage of the opportunity if there is that clarity. They want certainty with, operating in whatever environment. Let's take a look at the positive first here. I mean, we're faced with an economy, as the insert alluded to, that's rebounding after a decade of economic decline. How sustainable a growth story, though, are we looking at here, and what do you see being the drivers of momentum?
Yes, thank you, Alicia. I think what is very important to note is that the significant growth that the Zimbabwe economy has enjoyed over the last 3-4 years since dollarization has been at the back of very little foreign direct investment. So this is only from internal growth and the economy trying to resuscitate itself with very little international support, and also significant pressure in foreign investors understanding the policies that the country is putting through. I think one of the key problems that I think we've seen on the ground is that foreign investors have not spent a lot of time on the ground to actually understand the reality. but I think there's a lot of judgment of the progress on the ground from a distance. And I think this is a big, negative energy towards assessing opportunities in Zimbabwe.
Well, we'll get to you in terms of spelling out some of that clarity, or putting some of that clarity on the table for us being involved on the ground on that and in just a bit. Before we do, though, Martin, I mean, we've got George highlighting the fact that we've seen internal growth taking off in a very big way. Of course, that domestic development and growth coming through, but that can only be enhanced by a country that's integrated back into the world economy. To what extent are we seeing a reintegration of the economy within a global market, and what are some of the challenges being faced there?
Well, for me, and just picking on what Suresh said earlier, is that it's about policy consistency and policy certainty. Brand Zimbabwe, compared to 2000 or prior to the land grab issues of a decade ago to what it is today, has been significantly damaged. I mean, a lot of perception, negative perception towards the economy is to be overcome. I think the second point is, you mentioned Zimbabwe's integration to region economy or international economy. First and foremost, let's look at the region. I would argue that Zimbabwe and the political goings-on in Zimbabwe and frictions perhaps between Pretoria and Harare have impeded the SADC, the Regional Southern African Development Community Agenda, 15-member countries, population of 270-odd million people. And in recent years, every SADC meeting is talking, or maybe not so much lately, but has been talking about the perennial problem, political challenges, is Zimbabwe, rather than what needs to be done about integration for trade and investment and harmonization investment codes in our own region. So what I'm hoping to see is as we start to, the question for me is, the key question is, can Zimbabwe, the same government in power for 32, 33 years, renew itself? Can a staid, perhaps obsolete political system refresh itself and launch a new country going forward? Probably not. To see true economic progress, perhaps needs to be more dramatic political change going forward.
Having said that then, Suresh, I mean, we've got the country aiming to reach an investment GDP ratio of 25% by 2015. How realistic a target is that in your books?
Well, I'll be diplomatic and say it's very ambitious, given that you have a very, very undercapitalized banking sector. You have a major requirement for retooling that's really going to drive that particular economy. Until you get foreign capital into the country, getting that huge upsurge in economic growth is going to be extremely difficult. You've had China that has buoyed a number of the foreign direct investments into Zimbabwe over the number of years. China has been a key partner from Zimbabwe, and I think has been a very large contributor to the FDI inflows. I don't see much of other FDI inflows coming through, and I think, to allude to what George and Martin has said, I think the key issue was that we need this regional push in terms of providing foreign investors with some comfort through either some regional reorganization or regional integration as far as arrangements or bilateral arrangements are concerned. Particularly, even if we had to look at South African and Zimbabwean governments, there's been BIPA that has been there for a long time, but hasn't really taken and made any inroads in terms of assuring investors that their investments are safe within Zimbabwe.
Of course, so what's been in the headline all through the past few months has been the indigenization laws over in the country, and following the recent landmark Zimplat's indigenization deal, the subsequent calls for the process to be extended to the banking sector, the country's indigenization laws remain a controversial topic. So let's take a closer look at that before we get into more conversation.
There has been much controversy over Zimbabwe's Indigenization and Empowerment Act, leaving investors to assess whether current and prospective investments in the country still make sense. The Indigenization and Economic Empowerment Act requires foreign-held companies with an annual turnover of $500,000 or more to transfer 51% of their shares to indigenous Zimbabweans. The effects of the law are numerous. Economist Yvonne Mango spoke to the challenges of investment and liquidity, which are not made easier by the policy.
Government, which, as you know, is very cash-strapped, they're unable to invest in the economy, so you'd hope the private sector would compensate. But given such policies, it creates uncertainty, and those who are already in the economy or investors that are existing in Zimbabwe will slow or halt their investment. So in that regard, it slows growth. Secondly, a lot of those investors are in industries that export. So as you know, platinum is a big one, and platinum is a major export for Zimbabwe. It's very important in terms of financing the current account. As you know, the country is running a very big current account deficit. In addition, the country has a liquidity challenge as well, which reflects the fact that it's a dollarized economy running on a current account deficit.
Simon Reed, CEO of Imara SP Reed, one of the largest institutional fund managers in Zimbabwe, takes a pragmatic stance towards the policy.
Well, it does make life increasingly difficult because it adds a huge extra regulatory burden when it comes to capital raises, because everything still has to go through a political process instead of just being something that is done between companies and shareholders. That being said, indigenization, I think, is a given all over the continent these days.
With long-standing investments in the country, many companies have stayed put.
So I'm not seeing any companies running away. And you can read into the banking sector, companies like Standard Chartered, Barclays and so on, they're all still there. There's no talk of them actually pulling out of Zimbabwe. So again, it comes down to a negotiated solution on what best suits all parties going forward, and it will take time.
Some of the biggest deals negotiated to date include the landmark deal by Zimplats, held by Impala Platinum, which will sell 51% to locals for $971 million. Mimosa, held by the Implats and Aquarius Platinum joint venture, will sell 51% at $550 million. British American Tobacco will sell 21% of its Zimbabwe unit. The value of the deal is still to be determined. The deals, in particular Zimplats, will be closely watched as bellwethers for Zimbabwe's investment climate and security of operations.
The whole concept most investors understand. It's the manner in which it's done. They'll question things like whether they're going to be compensated for those stakes that are being taken from them. The transparency of the whole process. The certainty of the policy and whether the authorities actually adhere to that.
Indeed, the loudest call seems not to be for an end to the law, but for an end to the uncertainty around the details of implementation that have dogged the policy. With recent calls by the Indigenization and Empowerment Board for the banking sector to be next, it seems that the policy is here to stay.
Despite the hurdle placed by the law, Zimbabwe and its investors can align their interests. Indigenization can work. Panashe Chigmadzi, Johannesburg.
Let's get straight back into conversation now. George, you highlighted a little earlier that it's understanding of the policy that is lacking. You've, of course, been involved very intimately in this Zimplats deal. It's been labelled a landmark deal. Run us through the process and just how tough a negotiation process we're looking at. What are some of the obscurities that need to be cleared up here?
Yeah, I think the issue of policy is very important. I think, for instance, on the indigenization law, one of the misconceptions that I think has been carried through is that foreign companies are required or to transfer. You know, sometimes it's just use of words, transfer, cede, which send the wrong message. I think what is actually happening on the ground is disposal of 51% through a normal sale, which goes through a normal commercial process where the companies have been adequately valued and the deals are negotiated. I mean, for instance, the Zimplats transaction, where we were independent advisors, it took us 12 months of very, very rigorous negotiations between the government as well as the Implats. And it had to comply with all standards of international best practice, whether it's IFRS, requirements of stock exchanges, corporate governance. But I think these are things that should be understood, that when it comes to implementation, these transactions are actually done on a full arm's length basis.
When it comes to implementation, though, do we have domestic investors that, first of all, have the financial capacity to, to pay the price tag that comes with acquiring a 51% stake of a business, and do we have the skill set to run those businesses as well?
Yes, thank you. Let me start with the simple one, which is the skill set. All these foreign companies that have been operating in Zimbabwe, they are run by Zimbabweans on the ground. This is a fact. So this is not something that happened last year. It's been through and through since their operation. Number two, the issue of financing. I think it's a bit misunderstood, because typically of all empowerment deals, even what has happened in South Africa, most of them were notional vendor financed. And this is exactly the same instrument that we've used in Zimbabwe. And that's why, to demonstrate the success, and I think this is also one aspect I want to bring to the table, we have to measure the progress of Zimbabwe across all the policies from a track record point of view. What has actually been achieved? We're dealing with some of the biggest international investors in the world. I mean, Implat is not a small player.
Yeah.
Anglo Platinum is not a small player. Aquarius is not a small player. They have all the necessary skills and capacity to negotiate this transaction and assess the reasonableness.
Martin, to what extent are you buying into that? And, you know, secondly, taking a look at the those that operate in the country. I mean, we had Simon Reid highlighting in the insert that we aren't seeing businesses, in fact, turn their backs on Zimbabwe. But then one would assume you've got to draw a distinction between those already doing business in the country and new investors.
I listened carefully what Simon had to say, but also the figure was $971 million. That's over a quarter of Zimbabwean government's budget. I'm not sure how that's going to be affordable. For me, at a more macro level, is that, you know, I was reading a World Bank report on doing business in Zimbabwe yesterday, and to export a container out of Zimbabwe takes 53 days, and it costs over $3,000. To import a container takes 73 days, over $5,000. Of course, resource nationalism is, or indigenization as it's called in Zimbabwe, empowerment as it's called here, is an increasing force in Africa, in Australia, many economies. Unfortunately, it's come at large, unfortunately for the state at least, at the tail end, seemingly, of the last decade of commodity boom. But ultimately what's needed here, Zimbabwe is not a China, it certainly is not a Singapore, is the state's ability to, and as Suresh was talking earlier, to reach those investment sort of targets. How will we be reaching these investment targets when to do business in your country? Zimbabwe is ranked 168 or something out of 180 odd countries. And I'm sure that's near the very bottom of the list. And secondly is when companies of a $500,000 revenue, was it, turnover, over, you know, needs to have a 51% local shareholding. That's a major disincentive to foreign investment. So as a longer term perspective, I don't think this is sustainable. How can government meet these very, as you say, ambitious targets, whilst at the same time putting policies in place which are extremely, from the outside, very predatory?
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time in Singapore. I see in Asia, and I see 7,500 multinationals in Singapore. Would 7,500 multinationals be in Singapore if the government was enforcing a 51% equity transfer, sale, seed, whatever you want to call it? Obviously not.
Well, let's leave the conversation there for now. Obviously, these are the kind of debates that are raging at the moment when it comes to doing business in Zimbabwe. We'll be delving further into this conversation straight after the break, so stay tuned.